Happy Saturday and welcome to the Weekend Weird Files. We're still in the mountains, y'all, but I couldn't leave y'all hanging. And today we're going to be talking about a weird historical fact from the 1980s. And it hurts my feelings to put history and the 1980s in the same sentence, but I realize I'm not a spring chicken anymore. Well, let's get to it. So back in the 1980s, video games were starting to become the next big thing. The graphics weren't that great. There wasn't an online connection so that you could play with your friends. The only way we could play with our friends back then was to have them come over and you pass around the two controllers that came with the game system. And I can remember in high school, which was by then the late 80s, having my sister's boyfriend at that time and his friends come over in the afternoons and we'd all sit in the living room floor and play Super Mario Brothers on Nintendo. Those were good times. But let's get back to the earlier 80s. In 1982, a movie was released that became so wildly popular, it took the world by storm. It featured a little alien whose name was, and you guessed it, E.T. I think we went to the movies at least 3 times to see it because we really loved that little thing so much. It was so cute. And if you're from this area, you can probably guess that it was the Hub Theater in Newberry that we would go to see it. I have so many fond memories of that theater, from calling the recorded line to see what was playing and at what time. And then another fond memory, and it doesn't sound like a fond memory, was your feet would always stick to the floor because so many drinks had been spilled in the theater. That's not criticized. I'm not criticizing the place either. It's just a fond recollection. God, y'all, I can never talk anymore. But that's from my childhood and teenage years. Anyway, somewhere in the midst of that time, the Atari company controlled about 80% of the video game industry, which in that all was worth about $2 billion. They were the makers of games like Pong, Centipede, and they had successfully made a game from the Raiders of the Lost Ark movie. So Steven Spielberg came to the Atari people with the idea of making an E.T. video game. Well, why the heck not? I mean, the movie was a hit, so surely a video game would be too. The president of Atari paid a whopping $21 million for rights to the E.T. game. And their big plan was to get the game out by Christmas that year so they could at least break even with that big investment. But having that game out by Christmas would be no easy task because that deal between Atari and Spielberg had happened in July, and that gave them around 5 months to go through the whole production process and get the games onto store shelves in time to get them under the Christmas tree. Now, it had taken them 10 months to produce the Raiders of the Lost Ark game, so they would have to make this happen with E.T. in half the time. But get this, y'all, it gets even crazier. The video game designer had only 5 weeks to get the game designed. The designer was a fellow named Howard Scott Warshaw, and somehow he miraculously pulled it off. But Warshaw did say it was probably the toughest 5 weeks ever in his life. Well, like E.T. had been the much anticipated movie, the game hit store shelves with the same excitement. But it wasn't long after gamers started putting that cartridge into their consoles, they started complaining. The gameplay itself was confusing. And one big problem that I can remember from playing that game is that E.T. would fall into holes in the game and you just couldn't get him back out. It was like you'd have to restart the whole thing. So it was impossible and so frustrating. The game only sold 2.5 million copies, leaving tons of unsold copies with the Atari company. And you'll never guess what Atari decided to do with the leftovers. They took them out to the middle of the desert in Alamogordo, New Mexico, and buried them. Yes, you heard me right. They freaking buried them in the desert. But this little tidbit of information wasn't publicized. They tried to keep it under wraps. However, it somehow got reported in the New York Times, but it quickly became a forgotten fact. Because like I said earlier, there wasn't an internet And the internet now is like life support for those news stories that you want to die. And that secret stayed buried along with the games until 2014, when a filmmaker named Zach Penn and his documentary crew located the area that they had been buried in and dug them out. So, it's just crazy. Now, I couldn't find an exact number of how many had been buried, but burying unsold video games in the desert, though, is about the craziest idea. I'm not sure why Atari thought this was a great idea. I mean, why not just give them away or do something useful with them? I remember this happening, but it was buried in the dark corners of my brain. And I thought it was dumb then, and I think it's even dumber now. Can you imagine, though, y'all, what would have happened if Penn hadn't found those games and a distant future civilization found them thousands of years from now? Possibilities are endless for what they may have thought it was. Well, that's it for this week's Weekend Weird Files. I'll be back on Monday with an all-new mystery, murder, and magic.